Hi there, Sam McGinty back again to talk a little bit more about Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Crockett's Western Battalion. Today I'd like to focus on the clothing, equipment, and supplies that the battalion received throughout the Revolutionary War. First, we're going to talk a little bit about clothing. What I'm wearing here today, this is the first uniform for Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Crockett's Western Battalion. They were issued this early summer of 1780 while they were at the Albemarle Barracks in Charlottesville. First, very simply on top, this is what is called a hunting shirt. Pretty simple standard dress that we see a variety of American troops wearing throughout the Revolutionary War, pretty simply because it's cheap, easy, and allows a great degree of uniformity. Next, looking down, I have a white wool waistcoat. This is another piece that was issued to the battalion, or rather the cloth to make them. On my legs, a little bit of a different garment. These are what are called overalls or gaitered trousers. This is a very specifically military garment. We see these being issued both to British and American troops, sort of the latest and greatest technology during the war. Quite simply, what this allows is this is a one-piece garment that prevents rocks, dirt, and debris from getting in your shoes. It also allows you to just issue one piece of clothing for the entire sort of lower body. So this is the first uniform that Crockett's was issued in 1780. In August of 1780, Major George Walls, the quartermaster for the Western Battalion, went back to Richmond to the public store, or the storehouse for all the clothing and supplies for Virginia forces, and drew another allotment of clothing for the Western Battalion. This is certainly the most iconic uniform that the battalion would wear, and it's what you see here. For whatever reason, Walls bucked the trend of blue coats with red facings, which by 1780 had become fairly standard for Virginia troops, and instead went with brown coats with blue facings and brown shalloon for the lining. This is a pretty atypical coat, especially for Virginia troops. There are a few troops that do wear brown coats with blue facings throughout the Revolutionary War, but most of those were up in the north in New York. As to why they went with this color combination, we really don't know, whether it was something to do with advantages in the wood and camouflage, or whether it just was availability of cloth. That's really been lost to history. We do know that they made these coats at the Albemarle Barracks in the fall of 1780. It's very possible that the convention army that they were guarding, roughly 4,000 British and German prisoners of war from Saratoga, some of those regimental tailors might have had a hand in making these coats. That's something we've sort of speculated but don't have hard facts as of yet. Moving down, we have the same white wool waistcoat. That didn't change. We didn't get a new waistcoat. And further down, we have brown wool breeches made out of a similar cloth. So we've lost our overalls, but we have added Indian leggings. This is a pretty typical piece of frontier garb, something that's going to protect your legs from getting cut up on the bushes and brambles throughout North America. So this is the uniform that most of the enlisted troops will be wearing throughout 1780 and into 1781. The big contrast you would see with the officers of the Western Battalion, we know that they in fact had red facings on their coats. As to why, again, we don't really know. It's not very typical for officers to have completely different uniforms than the men. We also know that they had small clothes, basically waistcoats and breeches, made out of nankeen, a very popular type of cotton cloth in the 18th century. So here we have the third and final full uniform for the regular soldiers of Crockett's Western Battalion. This is what they wore from the time that they met George Rogers Clark in the late spring, early summer of 1780, all the way through the end of the war. So the regimental coat, which was issued the previous year in the Albemarle Barracks, that was maintained. They might be supplementing that with a hunting shirt in the summer just to sort of ease in the heat, but we do suspect that they maintained the coats throughout most of the war. Moving down, same waistcoat. We only ever have documentation of them issuing one waistcoat to the troops, and it seems to be that same white wool waistcoat throughout. Moving down, this is the big change. We've gone back to overalls. When George Rogers Clark took command of the regiment in Fort Pitt in 1781, he very immediately questioned why the men were not in overalls and ordered that 2 pairs of overalls be made for every soldier. So this uniform is the one that they took from Fort Pitt down the Ohio River to the Falls of the Ohio and served through to 1782. Moving on to some of the equipment, supplies, and sundries that the troopers of the Western Battalion had. First, we'll talk about how they're carrying things. This is a knapsack, what's called an old pack. This is a type that would have been pretty typical for quite a few different continental forces and state forces throughout the Revolutionary War. This is really great. It's sort of a pack that holds everything fairly large in size. This is carrying your food, your clothes, and whatever else you could probably stuff in there. Thankfully, we know quite a bit about what the battalion had when it was disbanded in 1782, because one of the soldiers of the battalion was nice enough to write down all the clothing he had on the back of his discharge papers. We know that he had 2 pairs of stockings, he had 2 hats, 4 shirts, 1 pair of leggings, 1 pair of breeches, 2 pairs of overalls, and a variety of sort of smaller things, neckerchiefs, so on and so forth. Beyond that, certainly you're carrying your food in your knapsack. Might be carrying bread like this, especially when you're in garrison in a fort type situation when you have the time to bake it. Elsewise, might just be getting flour each day, which is a little bit less pleasant. Moving on a little bit to the right here. First, we have our kettle. This type of tin kettle, about a 2-gallon kettle, was issued to each mess of the Western Battalion. A mess, typically a group of 5 to 6 men that are all sharing sleeping accommodations, food and rations, and one person within that mess would have to carry the kettle. Beyond that, we can look at what you're sleeping with. Blankets, pretty typical, fairly warm. This is made out of wool. What is not tremendously typical is the way of carrying it. This is what is known as a hoppus strap or a tump line. We do see these being used by a variety of troops throughout the Revolutionary War, but they're usually made out of hemp or other webbing, not made out of leather like this. We know that they had leather tump lines because George Walls, the quartermaster for the Western Battalion, barged into the state tannery and demanded enough leather to make hoppus straps and cartridge boxes for all of the men of the Western Battalion. Moving on to some of the weapons of war, first we can take a look at this. This is what is called a pattern 1767 French grenadier's hanger or briquette. We know that Virginia purchasers who traveled to France bought about 1,500 of these and had them specially inscribed Virginia Grenadier and Virginia Artillerist, and those were issued to state troops throughout the second half of the Revolutionary War. We greatly suspect that NCOs or sergeants of the Western Battalion, along with their sister regiment, the State Garrison Regiment to the east, were issued these swords more or less as a symbol of rank. By this point in 18th century warfare, swords are sort of falling out of fashion as an actually used item, but it does show sort of a bit of status. Moving on, closer quarters combat, but more specifically, a variety of camp uses. We have a tomahawk here. Tomahawks, very typical for frontier warfare, cheap, easy, and easy to replace if you do happen to break the handle. The other thing that we see, very specifically and differently for the Western Battalion, is the cartridge boxes they carry. We don't know exactly what they looked like, but we do know again that George Walls went to the state tannery and demanded enough leather to make cartridge boxes or pouches for each man of the battalion. This one, fairly simple design, 18 holes to hold cartridges, and a leather sort of frame around it to keep those cartridges good and dry. Beyond that, soldiers, particularly rifle-armed soldiers, might typically carry loose ball and powder horns. The horn, very important, it'll keep that powder good and dry. Beyond that, you definitely need to stay hydrated as a soldier in the 18th century, so a canteen is an essential. This type of canteen, known as a cheese box, might have been what is issued to the troops, might have been other designs of wood canteens, or perhaps even tin canteens. We really don't know. Moving on to some of the big ticket items. First, of course, is our firelock. This is a rifle. We know that Crockett's Western Battalion was issued 170 rifles. We don't know exactly what they look like, what the caliber was, or what kind, or even where they were made. We just know that they had rifles, which still makes them a little bit atypical for the 18th century. These are tremendously accurate guns, could shoot well over 200 yards fairly accurately. However, you do concede quite a bit in loading time. These are very slow to load. So sometimes efficient for frontier warfare, but sometimes a little bit problematic as well. Interestingly enough, we also know that Crockett's Western Battalion was issued a pretty high volume of tools. We suspect this was mostly to allow them to build fortifications, along with certainly shelter wherever they were going throughout the frontier. We know that they were issued draw knives, augers, froze, like you see here, a variety of different kinds of axes, adzes, saws, larger crosscut saws, and even mattocks. Now, certainly one person could not carry all these things. As we said before, the 18th century army is divided into its smallest units, which would be a mess, which would be 5 to 6 men. The tools usually would be distributed amongst those people.
That concludes part 1 of our discussion about the clothing and equipment of Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Crockett's Western Battalion. Be sure to tune back in next week, where we'll take a look at some of the additional forces that made up the battalion, like George Slaughter's Corps of Indian Fighters and the militia, and what clothing and equipment they might have carried. Until then, make sure you've liked the Frontier Culture Museum page here on Facebook to stay up to date with all of our posts, and just like Joseph Crockett, keep it honest and patriotic.